adage goes that if you don't wear green on St. Patrick's Day, you get pinched. So people who ventured out yesterday on St. Patrick's Day were either safe in their green or they endured, or I don't know, maybe enjoyed being nipped by the day's revelers or by people who have been looking for an excuse to pinch them for a whole year. Nevertheless, I wanted to reflect more on St. Patrick's Day than the silly ritual of pinching people who don't wear green, or even the more enjoyable ritual for many of drinking in celebration or eating corned beef and cabbage. I wanted to connect what really, to me, is the Irish struggle for freedom. Now, I do this because my maiden name is actually Malone, which is a surname derived from the Irish Mael Aon, which means a servant or disciple of St. John. And just a fascinating aside, St. John is also the patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the oldest church in the world. But now, of course, we know how my family of Black folks from southern rural Virginia got that name Malone. But it does call into question where and when those people of Irish descent came from and why they left Ireland in the first place. Sadly, that particular knowledge of the Malone family isn't something I am privy to, but I can look at the history of the struggle against British colonization and imperialism in Ireland and put some of those pieces together. Now, what we learn in most U.S. textbooks about why many Irish made their way to the U.S. was related to the Great Potato Famine and framed as some natural disaster that caused all the potatoes in Ireland to rot in the ground, not yielding enough food to support the Irish population. But that only makes sense if the only food Irish people ever ate were potatoes, and it clearly was not. There was a potato blight in 1846, but it affected only potatoes. Everything else grew just fine. So why was there a famine that took the lives of 400,000 Irish peasants between 1846 and 1847? Well, it was landlords, mostly British, who were given land and Irish peasants to work it as tenant farmers under the British policy of plantation that went into full swing under Elizabeth I in the 1600s, who evicted hundreds of thousands of peasants, these British landlords did, from their farms and destroyed their cottages rather than pay the local taxes for their poorest farmers, as British tax policy dictated in 1846 to support the famine relief. And then the landlords exported most of the rest of the food their farm produced, grain, cattle, as well as livestock, flour, eggs, and poultry, 17 million pounds sterling worth of food and produce in 1846 value to markets abroad, rather than giving that food to the poor right there in Ireland on those farms. Now, the British government, having finally fully conquered and colonized Ireland after trying since 1160, knew this was happening, and they did nothing to stop the British landlords or to help the Irish peasants. In fact, the Assistant Secretary to the Queen's Treasury, Sir Charles Trevelyan, wrote that the famine was, quote, an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. He further said that judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. That calamity must not be too much mitigated. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse, and turbulent character of the Irish people. The Anglican Church didn't speak out against the greed, selfishness, and hatred of the British toward the Irish, and 400,000 peasant farmers starved to death. Those who didn't starve stole to eat, and they were imprisoned for trying to survive. But many who were imprisoned weren't sent to prison in Ireland or even in Britain. Between 1791 and 1853, Irish courts, controlled by the British, sentenced over 26,500 prisoners to transportation overseas to serve their sentences as indentured servants to the 13 colonies in North America. and to a lesser extent to the island colonies in the British Caribbean. But the Irish continued to struggle against British colonization and imperialism and oppression long after the Great Famine of 1846 and 1847, from the Fenian Revolt in 1867 to the Irish Volunteers that were founded in 1913 to challenge British rule, then to the Irish Republican Army's establishment in 1919. And they were a militant nationalist organization that used military force to establish an independent Irish republic and to force the British out. The period of armed struggle against British colonial rule in Ireland spanned several very, very violent decades that included IRA bombings of British targets and too many unfortunate civilian deaths, leading up to the British soldiers' killing of 13 Irish Catholic civil rights protesters in 1973's Bloody Sunday massacre, and eventually to the IRA supporting prison hunger strikes of 1981, in which 10 Republican prisoners, 7 of which were IRA members, died in British custody, and finally to the Belfast Agreement of 1998, which established a new power-sharing government in Northern Ireland with IRA decommissioning. Basically, the Republicans in Northern Ireland agreed that they would remain a part of Britain for as long as the majority of the population wanted that to be so, and the IRA would cease its military operations, which it finally did in 2005. Despite the painful and complicated history of Irish deportees leaving the oppression of British colonialism and imperialism to rise up from indentured servitude in the U.S. colonies to partake in the oppression of African people and their descendants as plantation owners or managers or overseers, I still find solidarity with the struggle against the colonialism and imperialism of the British that the people of Ireland endured and to some degree still do to this day. And this is a point of solidarity that I find with all people who have suffered under the ravages of settler, colonial, imperialist, white supremacy, no matter where it happens around the world and no matter who it affects. I say this as I see the Asian community once again having to defend themselves against the xenophobic stereotypes that have been a part of their experience in this country for centuries. I remind myself that it's the colonial and imperialist aspirations and violations of the United States, France, and other Western nations against so many Asian countries that caused centuries of instability and bloodshed that brought people to these shores. And it's ironic that they escaped Western imperialism and they escape to the beating heart of Western imperialism. But this is how so many of us who did not choose to come here willingly came here. Being forced from your homeland because of war, famine, and criminalization isn't any more of a choice than being forced onto a ship at the point of a gun or a cannon. So the Asian community is once again under attack from the very ideologies that fuel settler colonial aspirations in the first place. The belief that non-European descended people and the resources in their countries exist to feed the whims of Europeans, and that the people are the throwaway playthings for the amusement of the conquerors until they tire of them. Be silent, be hardworking, put your head down, don't be seen, do as you're told, serve us, entertain us, pleasure us, and don't complain. My solidarity is with the people who are rising up against all of that in the face of yet another heinous act of violence. I stand with the Asian community in this country and around the world, all communities against imperialism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and all the expressions of all of that still oppress us all today. Follow Lukman Nation on patreon.com/LukmanNation for lots of great content.